The first fronds of goldenrod are starting here in the Wisconsin, which means it'll be a couple of weeks before we actually get any yield from it, if it actually blooms. But it's the last flow of the season and winter is coming, so we have to start thinking about winter in June or July if you're raising your own queens. And so this box here, this box 131/120, up until a couple of weeks ago was a yielding production colony. It had overwintered as in a nuc. It underwent the drone brood method. It got requeened with a queen in June, so it has an early queen in it, early for this summer that is, VSH, and it was produced 4 supers of honey. And then, because the flow has been so good, I ended up putting another deep of combs on top of the brood nest to see if that would fill some out, and it filled out a few of them. And then it came down to get ready for winter. Now obviously a colony that big, you can't overwinter it as is, and so what I did 3 weeks ago was I came along and I put the queen in this compartment of this 4-compartment framed deep box, and I put her in there with a couple of I think I've got a part drawn comb, another part drawn comb, and 2 undrawn combs. If I'd got 4 drawn combs spare, I would have put those in there, but there was brood in all the combs, and it was important to me that these were brood free. I'll come to that. So then, for the last 3 weeks, the queen had been on this side, about 1 brood cycle. And that meant that all the other brood would start, which was in the other deep and into here, would start to emerge in 3 weeks. So what I did was, last week I came along and I pulled off the supers and harvested those, and then I came back yesterday and I took the queen out of this compartment and I put it on some of the drawn combs, and I moved the drawn combs over to here. So this box here, on the face of it, you'd say, well, Adrian, doesn't that look like it's going to swarm? But when you think about it, it's just heavily populated. It shouldn't swarm because it's got no brood to leave behind. The only brood in there are the eggs that the queen will have laid since yesterday. And that means that there's no emerging brood in there. So what you see in the front, this population of bees, every day of several hundred of these bees will die off. Now, there isn't much honey in there. I left them with 2 combs. They have 2 combs of honey and 8 drawn frames and no brood. So the hope is that this colony will overwinter and not swarm. It should have enough foragers that it should go out and gather the goldenrod nectar if it appears, and then after it's done, then I'll feed it with syrup to 75 pounds if necessary. I won't make the mistake that I did last year, which was I did the opposite. I fed first and then the goldenrod put them into a swarming mode simply because there was simply so much of it. That was a stupid mistake. Now, quite rightly, you'd be asking, what about the brood that was in here? What did you do with those? Well, what I did with the brood that was in there was I come along and I took the brood out, and these 2 colonies, each of them were in a single 5-frame nuc, and my preference to overwinter a colony for ease of management is a 5/5. And so what I did was I took the brood and I put it in the bottom with some combs, and I put a newspaper on the top, and I put the existing nuc on the top of that. And so what that should mean is those queens that are in here were placed in early July, and so the brood will be turned over in there, but they won't really be old enough to gather much in the way of nectar from the goldenrod. So the bees, the deering bees, and the brood that went in the bottom should help, and we'll see if that works. The actual colony itself, this 5-frame box, it felt to be about 40 pounds. It felt really quite heavy. And so it's going to be interesting to see what that does. It's possible that I will have screwed this up and given it so much brood and so much resources that it will try to swarm. But considering that those queens have been actually only laying for a few weeks, I'm hopeful that I've got it right. But this is what we do in beekeeping. You're never really sure if you're making progress and the right decisions. You just try something. If it doesn't work, you come back the next year and decide something differently. So this yard has everything in it except for one is in a 5/5. And so this one here is my stray colony, and this one is has a queen in the bottom below the excluder and a ragtag mix of part drawn combs above it, some with brood, because when I went to the queen compartment I didn't have enough drawn comb that didn't have brood on to put in the queen compartments, and so I put a couple of undrawn combs. And so nonetheless that seems to be about where we're at. So we live, we learn, we hope. That's about it for me.